before we dive into plan making, we should talk to the communities first. We've identified some of the challenges, we've identified what the future may look like. Let's go out and talk to Charlestown. Let's go out and talk to East Boston and see what they want, how they may benefit, and then start to hear right from the communities, well, what's your on-the-ground experience? What would you want to see in your city?
This is Climate Conversations, a podcast by Climate X, the online community building a movement to solve our climate crisis. Welcome to Climate Conversations. I am Rajesh Kothirangan, and today I'm going to be flying solo with Mike Wilson, a graduate student in DUSP, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at MIT. We're going to be talking all about how urban planning and climate change intersect with each other. So Mike, I believe you study planning, and I always wanted to ask a planner, what is planning?
It's a very good question that planners ask themselves a lot. I was, my previous graduate degree was in landscape architecture, so I came at planning sort of from a design side and very quickly found that planners come from all different fields. You may have an economics background, a social justice background, you may be interested in real estate development. All of those people can fit into what planning is. In terms of what the direction that planning is heading in, it has a very long and storied history. Some of the things that planning has done over the years, we've taken a lot of time to reflect back on, and we've learned from our own actions. And moving forward, I think a lot of planning is about community engagement. It's helping people in communities and neighborhoods visualize and realize what they want their lives to be in sort of the medium to long-term future.
That's interesting you say that because, I grew up with planning being something that nation states do.
Yes.
Right? Because India had a planning commission. And every 5 years, we used to have this massive national plan, which was never successful. But, the idea was to put something out there that the nation would accomplish in the 5 years. And what's the relationship between that history of planning and what you are mentioning now, like looking back and saying maybe the planner's view of the world is a little different from what it used to be?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. My brain, when you said planning, went immediately to city planning as opposed to state planning. And that sort of gets at sort of how the planning is quite a big tent. State-led, state-level planning is a huge part of the history of planning. And, it's not something that I have personally engaged with as much. But yes, there's sort of the levels of success that has achieved have been remarkable progress, but also at, a remarkable expense as well, which is, on a much smaller scale, what we've seen with our cities.
So tell us what city planning is like these days.
City planning is a very exciting field, and I think given sort of some of the cycles of history, we're back at what some people would call an urban moment. Mm-hmm. The city is seen as being ascendant, at least for some, again, and that there's a lot of economic progress and prosperity that can be enacted in cities these days. In terms of what planning can offer, we can offer a lot of historical perspective, but also the tools about how to think about the future. And that those are really important as people who may have not been residents of cities before, as these cities are rapidly changing to be things that nobody has ever seen before. We have mega cities that are propping up around the globe. We have cities that have reached the point of being unmanageable right here within the U.S. using traditional political structures. Planning is really having to, be as innovative as any other field.
And you mentioned that about the urban moment, but already I'm also hearing counter voices, right? So something that comes to mind is Richard Florida's famous The Creative Class, which he seems to now backing away from himself. So what is this urban moment? And I'm guessing you are working in the Boston area because you're a member of the Boston Conservation Commission. What does the urban moment here look like too?
Yeah, no, and I think you're capturing a lot of planning intellectuals, there's a very heavy pendulum swing that happens. And as soon as you have enough data points to identify a trend, pretty soon that trend is now swinging in the other direction. And sort of the forces that we're looking at or we comment upon are generally beyond our control. And sort of if you have any sort of positive reinforcement to them, they can very quickly spiral to something that was very different than what you necessarily may have been talking about to begin with. I think one of the things that's quoted sort of in the mass public media is the rapid rate of urbanization around the world. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it, yes, is that traditionally we have been agrarian, we have been farming-based societies. Mechanization, industrialization has, allowed us to become detached from the land. There's questions of what that means and who controls that land. But as people move to the city or as cities become bigger or more dense, these are very old, ancient problems. How do people get together and, live beneficially in small quarters? How do we have private individual interests work in harmony with sort of a collective public good as well? And those are very well-worn but difficult problems to solve that require a lot of dialogue and communication.
And how does climate change impact all those tensions?
If nothing else, it basically just adds fuel to the fire on a lot of these things. It also gives a chance to sort of have a new reason to revisit things from a different perspective. There's a sort of movement right now afoot in terms of transformative adaptation rather than just regular climate adaptation that, that isn't just about building seawalls.
So transformative adaptation is a term of use?
Yes. Yeah, okay, it's a term of use. It's I guess probably relatively recent.
Okay.
But the concept being that, we need to think more beyond just gray infrastructure, sea walls, raising buildings, protecting infrastructure to things that are termed like green or blue, soft infrastructure. And as a part of that, this is an opportunity if we're making huge investments in our future in terms of what type of risks or losses we want to avoid. Why don't we use that money now to make societal benefits in the present that we can accrue over time? And at the same time, there are a number of social injustices and, poverty, inequality, and other things that exist due to sort of the way our institutions have been run, both domestically and internationally, that this is a chance and, something we should do to improve the lives of people and communities that, may have otherwise suffered at the hands of sort of business as usual.
I like that term, transformative adaptation.
Yeah. That's exciting, yeah.
So tell us how transformative adaptation plays into your own understanding of the future of planning.
Sure, yeah. I think it is about transforming institutions and the way the tools that are available within that world can be supplemented by other tools. And it also expands the debate to not what can we do or what do we want to do, but what we should do. And that makes for a more open-ended discussion about what the future may look like beyond just sort of what, the past has been.
So can you give us an example, especially in the Boston area, of a transformatively adapted project or like some place where this vision has become at least semi-reality?
In terms of plans, I think that's where we see a lot of, maybe not the rhetoric just yet in sort of the Imagine Boston 2030 in terms of the mayor's healthy, thriving, and innovative forward projection of what the city will look like in 2030. But certainly climate-ready Boston, as it looks towards, it didn't try to set forth what the vision will be from City Hall. It immediately said is that these are some of the tools that we're looking at, that this is resilience building is a broad-based social, economic, and physical phenomenon, and that before we dive into plan making, we should talk to the communities first. We've identified some of the challenges, we've identified what the future may look like. Let's go out and talk to Charlestown. Let's go out and talk to East Boston and see what they want, how they may benefit, and present them with some of the information experts have driven, and then start to hear right back from the communities, well, what's your on the ground lived experience? What would you want to see in your city? And that then drives some of the scale of thinking that's
So,
going on.
what are the kind of stories you are hearing in these exercises?
One of the things, especially with, say, like a neighborhood of affordable housing, NOAA, that's been doing a lot of work there, has been hearing is that the scale of what the residents are thinking of is both very individual but also very collective, where they're concerned about, if there is some sort of extreme rainwater event or storm surge event, the streets are flooded, that means their basements are flooded. If their basements are flooded, they store a lot of stuff down there that's really important to them. Their memories, what they are as a family can be in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
And, so helping people categorize what's in your basement, getting it out of the basement, those small things can build up to a lot of resilience in these communities. But that then also brings them to reflect upon, well, what's important about living in this place? What is special about being in this community? And that may not necessarily be what a planner from City Hall or, even the halls of MIT may think is important. And so investing in community spaces and thinking about how do residents of public housing or assisted living projects, how do they interface with new residents that are coming in and new construction and, then without changing necessarily the traditional neighborhood feel.
So, I can see so many moving parts in the system, right? There are, you could say, more technology-like parts, and there are more political parts. And how do you, and I know that you have a background at Harvard which has a more of a natural science to it, and you are now at DUSP and you're engaging with these planning practices. How do you fit all of this into at least a semi-coherent view of the world?
I would say, coming from my sort of environmental science and public policy background at Harvard, that I moved very quickly from sort of a mitigation, like what can we do now to offset future harm mindset, to future harm is already here and we need to act now to sort of bend the curve on adaptation, and we'll still be too late. So that was a very big pivot, and that moves me very quickly from the natural sciences over to the social sciences. As I began to explore that with my master's thesis, I found very quickly that once you pull on that thread, it gets very messy and very tangled. So thinking about adaptation options for, say, Boston Harbor, I started looking at the Charles River Dam. And the Charles River Dam was built in the 70s in response to a hurricane that came in the 50s. So already you can see that planning and engineering, financing lag. When it was not even yet complete, the blizzard of 78 hit, and it came within 40 centimeters of overtopping. And no matter what climate projection you believe in, the likelihood that at some point in the future there will be 40 centimeters of sea level rise is very probable. And the idea that the blizzard of 78, even if it is an extraordinary event, could happen again is also probable. So at some point, the Charles River Dam ceases to provide the protection and function that it was designed to give to Back Bay, Cambridge, and the basin upriver. But we live in Boston. There is no dry land to tie into that's higher than the Charles River Dam for, many miles to go around, and it's only protecting a very small part of the city. So, okay, let's move the barrier, dam, some sort of engineered solution further out. Okay, well, how are you going to pay for that? What else do you need to attend to that infrastructure behind this wall you've now built? Where's the right place for that? And then, hold on, that's not protecting everything we think it should. And it's not going to last for as long as we need it to. So what if we may put it further out? And, these are some of the things that academics, especially at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, are looking at.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing where you start to pull on the thread and it gets very messy. And that's where we start to need to look at, well, what's an institutional response? Because an engineering response is going to only sort of double down on the problem and get us into this sort of complex systems failure.
Can you speak a little bit, because I know You mentioned on another occasion that when planning works, you don't know that it's working, right? In fact, it's in the background. So how do we bring the importance of planning into the foreground?
So I think one of the things that we're starting to see, and you can't attribute it to climate change necessarily, but I think maybe you can attribute it to greater awareness about climate change being out there and thinking more about what constitutes a disaster or some sort of catastrophic event. And that not all of these storms have names. Not all of these things are storms. So like we are naturally drawn to say like a Hurricane Katrina or a Sandy or, Maria now, and we can point to sort of how this one event, stochastically affected the community. And that's a shock that was delivered to its system. But what it's revealing really is long-term stresses that are underneath. Okay, so there's those named storms, but what about the flooding that's in Baton Rouge? All of a sudden, a weather system just parks over top of your city and delivers a deluge. And I think that's where, as we start to see more of those types of events, or at least our attention is drawn to those types of events that have always been occurring, and we're giving a different type of attention, that's where planning in terms of bending the trend is very important. That those long-term stresses are what's being revealed. It's not necessarily that it poured, biblical amounts of rain. It's that the people who were living there didn't have great access to transportation to begin with. They didn't have a fantastic power infrastructure. They had chronic levels of underinvestment, and maintenance had been deferred on critical infrastructure systems, and that these people may not have necessarily a safety net to fall back on, and that these people could be us, that this could happen anywhere in any of our communities to people of any means, and that this is incredibly disruptive and doesn't necessarily need to be a catastrophic one-off event, but this is sort of a new normal that may happen, and that is incredibly difficult and challenging for society to deal with.
Yeah. We want to ask our listeners, and they want to ask us, how do I get involved in this? Like, what are the kinds of things that people can get involved in which would be of importance to planners, right? So, like, for example, there's a huge movement now towards citizen science. But is there an analogous thing that citizens can do in the planning world?
I think one of the things that's tough with getting involved, and especially in something as wide-reaching in its sort of consequences as climate change, is that not everything looks like climate change and often doesn't even have the label climate change for, fear of provoking a negative reaction among some people and being more widely applicable. So you have things like, say, the gas tax, that we should index that to inflation. And that was one of the things that was on a state ballot initiative. Is it linked to climate change? Sort of, maybe, yes. If gas costs more, people buy less gas, therefore there's less pollution. If there's more money in the coffers to improve the roads and transit systems, then that will also bend the curve on emissions reductions and stuff like that. But that comes at a personal cost. And each time, if you're faced with sort of these discrete decisions about, should I do something about climate change today that costs me now? I think that's where it's like at some point you have to say, actually, yeah, and it's already costed me because I didn't invest or take action earlier. And that's true with a lot of things. That's the same thing with public education systems or, security and, the current opioid crisis. These are long-term issues that require involvement, and at any given moment, it doesn't seem like that will be the thing that's like, oh, I need to stand up and vote. I need to make my voice be heard. Those moments are very rare, and those are important too, where it's like there is a march or a rally going on Boston Common on this day, and the weather's great. Go out there with your sign. That's important, but it's also every other day, or it's when it comes time to vote that you need to be present. and accounted for.
Yeah. You need to be able to think through what the costs and benefits are of these actions and be able to sum them over the years and then say, okay, well, the tax was worth it.
Yeah, and the engagement is iterative. It's not sort of, and that's where it's hard. Your civic advocacy and involvement is never done. There's always the next thing. There's always, and that's sort of the price of progress, is that you have to be constantly present.
Let's hope that we all make that happen. But thank you so much, Mike, for sharing your thoughts with us and for, I think, a fascinating conversation about how many different types of skills and ideas that we need to be juggling to address climate change. Certainly in the Boston area, but I think everywhere in the world.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for inviting me in, and appreciate the time we spent discussing these things, and hope people get a chance to think about it.
Yeah, I hope so too. I have to say, that was an interesting interview. So many complexities. I have no idea how we're going to address every single one of them. But if you do, you should write to us at climatex@mit.edu or reach out to us on Twitter and Facebook. And of course, you can leave a comment underneath this podcast post. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.